Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Mike and Ranking Member Rahal, for holding this hearing on the Chairman's bill to privatize the Northeast Corridor. I'm glad we're holding a hearing instead of a markup, as I think was originally intended. This is a pretty drastic proposal that makes sweeping changes to the intercity passenger rail system. It requires careful thought and deliberation, and I appreciate the Chairman's willingness to slow the process down so we can begin to address the many questions and concerns raised by the legislation. The bill requires Amtrak to redeem common stock and transfer its assets to DOT. At the same time, it directs the Secretary to solicit, quote, expressions of interest from private entities to build and operate high-speed rail service, and then it gives $2 million to the top contenders to prepare a more detailed proposal. It's not clear why an entity that supposedly has enough funding to build and operate a high-speed rail line needs taxpayers' support just to write a proposal. Then the Executive Committee establishing the bill would evaluate these proposals, select the best one, and notify Congress of its decision. Congress would have no role in the decision. Congress would just be told what will happen, and the Secretary is directed to implement the Executive Committee's selected plan and grant a 99-year lease to the Executive Committee to carry it out. One of the biggest problems with the bill is that it sets in motion the elimination of Amtrak before any proposals are reviewed or recommended. We have no idea if there are any viable private financing schemes that adequately meet the desired criteria. We have already requested proposals in PREA, and none were submitted for the NEC. I understand the Chairman has indicated that he thinks DOT didn't really act in good faith in search of proposals, but his bill setting up a new RFP is also in the hands of the DOT. Regardless, the logic doesn't follow that, therefore, we should first eliminate Amtrak and then hope that a solution will magically appear. As the Chairman knows, I have supported his quest to research and review privatization proposals. But why should we take the drastic actions laid out in this bill until a detailed plan has been presented and properly evaluated? Why should we disrupt or eliminate current service and potentially lose good-paying jobs until we know what will replace it? And why shouldn't we keep investing in Amtrak in the interim and allow it to compete as well? Another major problem is that this bill grants broad authority, including eminent domain authority and preemption of several state and local laws, to this Executive Committee, which is eventually to be staffed by the private entity with a lot of unanswered questions. There might be legitimate reasons to have such authority, and generally speaking, I support it when furthering interstate transportation and commerce that is clearly in the public interest. But under this bill, we don't know exactly who we're giving this authority to or when or how it will be used. This is a monumental states' rights issue and a very broad grant of authority to an unknown, unaccountable entity over our districts. There are simply too many unanswered questions to allow such broad federal preemption and to place it in the hands of a private entity. I also question the provision of the bill requiring Amtrak to redeem all common stock at the book value. DOT performed a valuation and determined the stock is worthless, which an evaluation the courts have upheld. Under this bill, Congress is stepping in, providing a direct windfall to at least one of the shareholders. I have concerns about the takings issue in the bill, but beyond that, this could create a real problem of unjust enrichment. I'm frankly surprised that, as my friends on the other side of the aisle are pushing drastic cuts across the federal budget, that they would agree to just handing someone a windfall of hundreds of millions of dollars. These are just a couple of the big picture concerns. There are many other troubling aspects of the bill, such as inadequate labor protections, the potential impact to the railroad retirement system, and increased costs for the freight railroads, the probable loss of state support in long-distance routes, and the shifting financial burden to states and local governments. If one of the main goals of privatization is presumably to reduce federal funding, it seems odd to leave the federal government with such significant costs and liabilities. I would rather take that money invested directly in Amtrak's plan to eliminate the $9 billion backlog created by federal underinvestment and to implement Amtrak's plan to upgrade its high-speed rail service. My biggest problem with this bill is that it throws the entire passenger rail system off a cliff and hopes a safety net will suddenly appear. At least it hopes the NEC is saved. It doesn't deal effectively with other routes except to remove the cross-subsidy from the Northeast Corridor that now supports them. These are risks I'm not willing to take. As of now, I must oppose this bill, but I do commend the fact that we're holding a hearing, and I hope we can explore many of the subjects raised by the bill, but we certainly shouldn't take the approach that the bill does of, in effect, abolishing Amtrak and then hoping a proposal will emerge that can adequately replace it. I think that's, to put it mildly, putting the cart before the horse. I thank you. I yield back. Mr. Boardman, first of all, given that Amtrak is a for-profit corporation, owns the Northeast Corridor, think the bill raises serious Fifth Amendment problems with the takings clause. Under your reading of the bill, when Amtrak transfers the Northeast Corridor to the Department of Transportation, what compensation would Amtrak receive? And when Amtrak transfers the rolling stock to the DOT or private interest as required under the bill, what compensation would Amtrak receive for that?
Well, the way we read it right now is that we receive no compensation for either. In fact, as a taking, in the history of a taking, that's not what we do in this country, and that's not what happened when the corridor was transferred to Amtrak back in 1976. The private owners were paid substantially, even though they were bankrupt for that.
So you think this would be a taking of both the rolling stock and the infrastructure?
Well, the rolling stock's a little different because we owe enough debt on that debt would have to be satisfied before they could take it at all. That's owned by the banks.
Okay.
So there wouldn't be that availability, and Amtrak would not have it.
But the mechanism that the bill sets up has a serious takings problem.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, the proposal would strip Amtrak of its biggest asset, the Northeast Corridor, and its rolling stock while leaving Amtrak with the resulting debt. Do you have financing for most of that rolling stock now?
For most of our rolling stock, yes.
And how do you transfer the rolling stock if you're still making the payments on it?
Well, as I said, we can't because we wouldn't have the money to pay off the debt. It wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have revenue anymore.
And could you transfer it if whoever you were transferring to assumed the balance of the debt?
Well, that's not what the legislation said.
No, but would that work?
Well, if they took the debt with the equipment and all of that, it certainly makes it so that it doesn't get lost.
Now, Amtrak makes a considerable profit on the Northeast Corridor and cross-subsidizes all the other routes from that. Is that correct?
That's, well, for operating, yes.
And if this bill or something like it were enacted, what would happen to the other corridors,
Well,
other than the Northeast Corridor?
What would happen, especially with us being left with the debt, is that we couldn't service it and we couldn't operate without additional federal subsidy.
So that the other corridors would have to shut unless there were an additional federal subsidy?
That's correct.
Do you have any idea the order of magnitude of that additional subsidy that would be required?
Well, one of the difficulties of that, and Rick and I were talking about transparency, is that the allocation formula across both the direct and indirect makes it difficult to figure out completely accurately what should be applied to those other corridors. But in this particular case, it would be a lot easier because all the indirect costs would then be applied to the other corridor. I haven't added them up. But it would be very expensive.
Very expensive. Thank you. Let me ask you another thing. In the dialogue a moment ago with Mr. Witkind, he made very clear that the labor protections that labor now has with Amtrak would not be carried through by this bill as currently drafted. Various people are not under the Railway Labor Act, et cetera. Let's assume that were changed, and all the labor protections were in fact carried through. What would that do to the financing structure of this bill?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. And
let's assume that the bill were changed.
Yes.
And every labor guarantee that Amtrak employees have, whether Railway Labor Act or whatever, were in fact carried forward. They were held harmless. What would that do to the financing of the bill? How much cost would that impose on whom?
Well, it's going to cost C2, if everything goes down, of a little over $4 billion over a 5-year period of time. You have the rest of the labor protections that are existing out there would be transferred to whoever would be the operator for the future on the corridor. I haven't added up those numbers, Jerry, but
they would have to. But presumably they would have to put that in the bids as cost factors.
Oh, I see where you're going. That's correct. They'd have to have that.
And that would be very expensive.
That would be as expensive as what it costs for us.
Thank you. Mr. Witkind, last question. You said that in addition to the problem, that even if all the labor problems, even if in fact the labor people, all the workers were held harmless and every protection was carried through, you still have other problems with this. Could you just briefly outline what those other problems are?
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. We do. I don't think balkanizing our passenger rail system and allowing private sector interests to chase profits is the way you run a national transportation system. And that's exactly what this bill would do. Those with wealth would try to create more wealth with that wealth, and the rest of the system, which relies on cross-subsidies, relies on services into communities that don't have the density of the Northeast Corridor, would all completely wither. As Mr. Mica said very appropriately, capitalists don't chase investments that lose money. They're going to chase investments that make them money. And so we think this is a flawed model that's been tried in many industries around the world, around our country, and it always ends up giving the public sector the shaft and, unfortunately, the workers the shaft.
Thank you. My time is expired.
Thank you.